Hi, welcome back. So I'm just curious. Did I send you those silly intro musics?
Yes,
I
love
was
those.
going for a like a world of sports vibe. It didn't exactly get there. I feel like it needs more work, but I ran out of credits on the on whatever that site is, Sonus, whatever that thing is called.
Suno, Sonu.
Yeah, Suno, whatever. But I'll keep trying until we get the intro music.
I liked it. I felt like it was like the type of music that like you're the main guy's walking away from the car exploding in the background as he like in the movie. It was very
Yeah,
dramatic, very
it has
dramatic. I
like
like
that.
that.
But then like when I thought about it like that, it had like the Nick Cage kind of vibe,
Mhm.
and I don't know, Con Air kind of thing going on. Like I'm not sure.
That's not
Um,
generally people's first association with me anyway. They don't look at me and are like, "Oh, that guy reminds me of Nick Cage from Con Air." I don't get that so often.
I totally hear that. But yeah, well, we could go down the whole Nick Cage like rabbit hole here and never get out. But yeah, okay. Let's dive in. Our topic today is older versus younger donors. We'll talk about that in just a second. First, start with our good of the week. I'll go first for this week. My good of the week is personal in nature, just because like I think that's part of what we're trying to do here is promote good and appreciate it and celebrate it. And so last week, my oldest daughter got married, and that's about a good thing for a long time. Like, there's not a lot of things I feel like that beat that, let's say. And it was certainly a new experience for all of us. So it was an amazing evening. The build up to it was like just something I'm not used to. Obviously, the experience itself was a little crazy to me. I had those sort of Steve Martin, Father of the Bride type of vibes going on before, during, after, like just a lot of that was sort of like running through me. But it was really special, really meaningful, and uh,
I'm
yeah,
curious. I'm curious. You don't have so many years on me, but I feel like you're a little bit of like in terms of the ages of our kids. You got like a life stage on me. My kids are younger than yours. Like what? I don't know if it's advice or like insight that you took away from being the father of the bride. You have like your kids are older at this point. They're legitimately on their own, independent.
yeah. I didn't think of it so much. I've thought about it a little bit over time, like that's a thing, but like every everyone said to me like, oh, you're at a new stage. I didn't want to accept that that's true. I know that it's true, but I just didn't like. I processing the idea that that's the case now is like super. It's hard. I told a couple of people in my head, she's 23, but like in my mind, she's 4. You know what I mean? Like she's still in my head, like the little kid and the little girl, and the person we ripped away from her home in New York and moved to Israel with at 12. And so I know that all that other stuff has gone on since then, and I know that she's not 12, and I know that she's 23, and I know she's an adult and she's in school, and she found someone to spend the rest of her life with, which I'm like thrilled by. It just doesn't fully compute yet in my own head. And now I more, and maybe this will resonate, I more appreciate the comment that like my father-in-law says all the time is that you see me as 75 and I see myself as 25. Um, and in his and I always thought it was like a trite like comment, but I get the idea that in his own mind and when he sees himself in the mirror, he doesn't see 75, he sees 25. And I feel the same. I don't see 49. I see, the father of this little kid. I remember her first moments. I remember when she was born. I remember naming her. I remember all that stuff. And so it's like it does go cliche, but it does go faster um, than you can hold on to. So it's like you're trying to hold on to all these things for all time, and you can't. And so it's like it's a lot. And then it all just sort of the event happens, and it's like wow, okay, like you know, different state.
Sure, sure. Okay. I don't know exactly how to take that and implement it into my life somehow, but I'll figure it
There's
out.
no there's no way to there's no way. The only thing I can say is like when you can like slow it down, figure that's I think the one thing for me, and I've tried that over time, but like I very much, and this was advice that someone gave me, a friend of mine gave me before the weddings, try to stop during the event itself and capture certain moments
Sure. Take those
in
like
your head.
mental pictures. Yeah.
Yeah, and really hold those. Like those are not the ones that are going to go on cameras. They're not going to go on videos. They're just in your own brain and in your own mind, in your own heart. And like I initially fluffed it off as like, like not my kind of advice, but I definitely had moments like that during the event itself while it was going on. So, and I would apply that back to everything else. Like when one of those moments happens, don't need to capture it on a camera, just capture
Sure.
it. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Just to give you a sense of my life stage tonight, for I think the first time, my wife and I are planning on going out and leaving my oldest in charge. First time we're going out without a babysitter, leaving the kids. So like that's where we are, the life cycle stage, life stage there.
Good luck.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're not going very far as our trial run. We're going to like a city event here, like 5 minutes away. But it's our trial run to see how this goes. A little bit
Ah,
different where you are and where we are at the moment.
no, I remember that too. It took us years after we had children. It took us years until we got away, like,
Yeah,
for a vacation. It took years until we either, besides financially, could do it, but like just mentally could trust somebody with our children and leave them for any period of time was like it. So I totally get. And so your oldest is in charge tonight?
he's in charge. Technically, the way we've structured it is my two oldest. I have two boys who are a drop older than the girl. The two boys are in charge. We thought it was good to make number two part of the solution. So number one's not in charge of number two. Number one and two are in charge of number three, which
I only trust one because he's at least commented on the podcast. Your second one has not yet. So I'm not sure I have any faith in him.
in his defense, he doesn't have a phone or access to any device that could play the
Okay.
podcast. But fair enough. Fair
Fair
enough.
enough. Okay, give me
Yeah.
your give me your good of the week.
Okay, so my one of the week is from a little bit of a unexpected or a random place, which is a novel that I'm reading. I read very slowly, but I like reading. It takes me forever to finish a book because I get about 3 pages in before I fall asleep. But I've been reading one that's really good. I have it right here. It's called The Island of Missing Trees by Elise Shafak. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the reason why I bring this up is because there's a passage in the book, without getting too much into the details. There's a teenage girl that goes through a relatively socially traumatic event in school that her father gets wind of and tries to confront her about to make sure that she's okay with everything that happened. An embarrassing video of her gets released. And the passage that the author writes in the book, from the perspective of the daughter, is pretty much how easy it is to shrug it off and pretend to her father like it's no big deal, because her father is someone who needs things to be running smoothly. He's a busy guy, professional, like he's not looking for problems to solve. So when she's able to, say the right combination of words and brush it off like, yeah, this happens, it's no big deal, I'm fine, he's very willing to accept those words and move on with his life. And the passage is really, really beautifully written about the daughter's perspective on her being able to do this for her father. And it got me thinking about the podcast about fundraising, is because in a lot of ways, I feel like we're all built that way. None of us are going looking for problems to solve. And I think that that's one of the reasons, to bring into a fundraising perspective, one of the reasons why it's hard to get on the radar of donors and for really to articulate and explain the reason for an organization's existence, the reason why donors' donation is so important. That's like a really hard thing to convey, because it takes someone to stop and get out of their zone of what they're doing their day to day and really put themselves and see it through someone else's eyes and go through sort of an existence that's not their own. It's like a form of myopia, I guess, is I think the right word for it, where you can only sort of see what you can see. You can't see beyond that. And even though this wasn't in a perspective of fundraising or anything like that, I just thought it really well captured at least how I feel a lot of times, because I saw myself as the father in this, and I saw myself as a person in this, where it's like people talk to me about their problems or they'll complain about, whatever, work, relationships, money, whatever. And it's like I can nod and sort of like go through the motions of being empathetic. But to really like stop and feel that pain is hard. It's not, I don't think certainly not in my nature. It's like, and I don't think I'd like to think it's not really in human nature, unless I'm just like cold and heartless. Like it gave me pause and gave me another appreciation for the job that fundraisers have to do in making sure that that pain that their service recipients feel is
Right.
conveyed to donors.
Super interesting. I'm not usually reading novels that I'm thinking through to fundraising, but I love that like you are.
Can't help it. Can't turn it off. I try. Can't do it.
Maybe you should read faster. You would have less time to think through the lessons learned in fundraising from the novels that you read.
Yeah, right. The last one I read was about a total like revenge story, so that might be harder to adapt. This one was a little bit easier.
Yeah, it does get me to like a side project that I've been thinking about, which is writing a novel about fundraising. It sounds terribly boring, but it's like a murder mystery. But yeah, I know, right?
My curiosity speaks.
It's nonprofits. Do tell. Okay. Okay. Good. That's our good of the week. I appreciate that both sides on the personal side this week, as opposed to strictly the professional side, which I think is important. Okay, here we go. So older versus younger. Let me set the stage for you here on this subject, if I can. You're an executive at a nonprofit. You're planning a major fundraising campaign. You've written perfect copy. The text, the emails are great. And then when you look at the data, half your audience doesn't open it. You post a great video, but nobody watches it or shares it. And the reason is because your organization, as whatever it is that you do, is bifurcated in terms of your support audience. You have a group of older people that support you, and you have a group of younger people that support you, and they really, for whatever reason, they don't cross. So the question you have to deal with, Raimy, is what do you do? What do you do when that's your bag or some version of it? And how do you manage that as a leader in the organization as you're going forward?
Well, before I start getting on my soapbox talking, I'm curious to hear if you have thoughts on this. Like, how do you see it breaking down?
Well, yeah. So the first thing I did yesterday in preparation for this is I polled some friends. I asked some colleagues, I'm like, hey, like, how do you handle older versus younger in terms of your, I know how I used to do it, but I'm curious as to how they're doing it right now in the organizations that they're working in, or how they're coaching or strategizing with leaders in that space. Like, what are they doing? And I got everything from, we do nothing different, which surprised me, to I ignore a certain audience completely, which I thought was super interesting, to the idea that we're trying to cater to both audiences with different things based on either, specific types of interest or types of engagement or whatever it is. And I definitely resonated with a lot of what everyone said, and knowing them in terms of their organizations. But in general, I sort of appreciated what they were driving at in those different spaces. Like, the first thing I thought of when we decided to talk about the subject is like, look, what does that mean that we have like multi-generational audiences? Who are the different generations? What does the data say about the different generations? Like, I was thinking a lot about the data. One person sent me the name of a study to read, which I spent a few minutes on last night as well, to just look at some of the data, appreciate some of the, like, how they're breaking it down. Like, it opened me up to appreciating and remembering how my experience had gone with the different audiences.
Interesting.
Non-answer to your question.
Yeah. Well, so the thing that surprised me most in preparing for this is when I sat down first to really organize my thoughts around younger versus older donors, I thought I was going to have a really lengthy list of differences between them and the way that we should approach them. And I was prepared for that. And then as I started putting a list together, I saw a lot more commonality than I anticipated. I think there are certain differences, right? So like younger donors are going to be on social media and they're going to be on different social media than their older counterparts. So I think that sort of like distribution method of your message has to be stated. But overall, in terms of the multi-channel ways that you have to get in front of people, making sure that the ways that people can give, the financial vehicles in which you can give, are all painfully clear. I think that those apply to younger donors and older donors alike, sometimes for different reasons, right? Sometimes for different reasons. Like I think older donors are much more savvy, financially literate about the ways that they can give than younger donors. So I think there's more of an education piece for younger donors that they have the ability to give through, sometimes through their employer, sometimes through some of the stocks that they've either purchased or have inherited or been gifted. And sometimes they don't know that sort of information. Older donors, I sense tend to know that more, but still want those vehicles available to them. That the Venn diagram of commonalities between them and making sure that those vehicles are available to both. That part of the circle, that part of the circles, much bigger than the ones that are by themselves, and that sort of surprised me. And we can go through some of the things that I was thinking as I was putting together this list. But my overall headline was that there's a lot more in common than I anticipated uh, before I started doing this exercise in earnest.
Yeah, we're going to go there. I would step back for a minute and appreciate for a minute who are we talking about? Like, what does it mean, younger donor? What does it mean, older donor? Like, just like my first exercise here was defining terms. Like I went through a research exercise with Perplexity in preparing for this and appreciating what is it when people say younger donors, who are they talking about? When they say older donors, who are they talking about? So the research sort of breaks it down into what you might call, let's say, five generations or five groups of people that fit to the donor class, right? So you have, even older than baby boomer, right? So almost like 80 plus who are still out.
The silent generation, I believe.
Yeah. So, right. So, and you talked about them a little bit when you talked about the transfer of wealth. That's it. That's the World War II generation, for lack of a better term. And, they were highly successful, let's see, in the United States. And so they have the abilities so that's like the highest, oldest generation. They're operating mainly on paper. They're going to read something. They're going to sit with you. They're thinking about legacy gifts and, planned giving. That's where their mind is, or inheritance to their children, stuff like that. Down next, you have the boomer generation, which probably holds the largest amount of wealth certainly in the United States. And so maybe they give differently. Maybe they're a little bit more savvy. Maybe they give the most, or I think they're the largest generation of donors in terms of numbers of potential donors.
By far.
And so, how they give will be differently than people older than them, people younger than them, right? It's what they're thinking about, because they're almost sandwiched a little bit between, let's say, dealing with older parents and dealing with children and grandchildren. So that what their responsibilities are in terms of their wealth are different than, let's say, the next generation. And then you go down to, I think you're in this generation, the Gen X. Are you a Gen X or a Gen, like you're a millennial or a Gen Z?
I don't, it depends, I think, where the cutoff is. I'm not born in 83. So I think depending on where you are.
Yeah, you're like a millennial.
I'm a millennial.
Shoot, man. Okay.
Sorry.
I am Gen X. So, which I'll take, but Gen X is sandwiched even further because they still have, responsibilities at home, younger children in that stage of their career. Maybe they're still growing in their career. Their wealth is not yet settled in a lot of cases. And so they're operating different. Then you go down, then you have the last two, which is the millennials and the Gen Zs. And they're different. Like I spoke to somebody yesterday about these groups, and they very much focused on the idea that these two groups, more the Zs than the millennials, are very focused on, interested in volunteering. They view time as much and equal value to money. Even if the organization doesn't, they do. They're giving less. And then you have that down to the Gen Zs, which is the youngest category. So for me, that was important to first appreciate who we're talking about, let's say, and what the data shows as to how they participate and how they donate and where they're giving the most of their money. This was from a QGive Millennial Report, I think it's called the Millennial Giving Report, which goes through or the Multi-Generational Giving Report, I think is what it's called, which goes through all these things. And for nerds in the space like us, it's a worthy read. But truth is, for anybody who's dealing with the scenario I provided, it's worth understanding you know, your audience is better. This is a good way to get deep on the different kinds of audiences that you potentially have. And then to see then, okay, now that I know that, are there actually differences in how I approach these audiences when I'm actually doing the work? Or are there not differences? And maybe there should be. And I'm not doing the work that I need to be doing because I'm not covering younger donors the way that I should, or I'm not covering older donors in the way that I should. And what's the unlock that's there that allows me to do a better job with those audiences? So like for me, that was a super important exercise just to get clarity on what I mean when I say younger donors versus what I say older donors, and what do I do with them?
But before we start to get to the strategies of what we're talking about, the one thing I want to add to what you're saying, and this is for me sort of a switch was flipped when I understood this, was that you and I have been in the field, for a long time. And when I started, the way we talked about older donors, the way we talked about in the trends that they gave, I sort of held in my head as absolute truths. And what I didn't realize, I think the way that I was thinking about it for a really long time is like, oh, once you turn 75 or 70 or whatever that age is, like you start responding to direct mail and writing checks, right? There's a difference between your age and your birth year, because because people are, what we're saying now about people who are, let's say 70 plus, it's not going to be true in 10 years about the new generation of people that's 70 plus, right? The habits are going to change based on essentially your birth year, right? Like and you can think of it as just being like, I don't know, the example that jumps in my head is like, older people play stereotypically like, bridge and mahjong and all these card games. Like, it's not like when you turn 75, you start playing these types of games, right? When we're that age and we're in the assisted living facilities, like there's a better chance that we're going to be playing video games, right? Because like,
But we'll still go to the early bird.
obviously that doesn't change.
Yeah, I want to
Not
make sure.
everything changes, but
So
like,
Broken Vista phase 2, here I come.
that's the next life cycle. But it's like, it's based on habits, right? And we're gonna always be online. Like our grandparents weren't online. Our parents sort of are, and maybe some are, some have better literacy than others when it comes to it. But it was an interesting flip for me that I was like, oh, the things that I learned about older donors when I first entered the field 20 years ago aren't true about the new older donors now. So I thought that was an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, I always tell, like when I work with our organizations that have older donors, current older donors, I always use my parents as an example. Like they do very little online, like very little. And
Your parents or the organizations?
It's my parents.
Okay.
And so if you're trying to reach them today to make a donation, you either have to call them, you have to show up in their house or their synagogue, or you have to send them something in the mail because they still read direct mail, right? And then maybe they'll put a check in the mail, right? But they're never going to put a credit card number on a website. They'll never trust a giving page. They'll always think that it's not just them. They'll always think that it's going to get right. So, and they're always think like, and unfortunately, older people, current day older people are the ones who do get scammed, right? These online scams and these other things like that. It does happen to them. So, there's something to it. But I definitely hear that. Right. So our grandchildren, when they're donating, in the future, they'll just think about a donation and it'll happen. And I'll still have to click the button on the page or something version of that similar. But yes, I think that's an important piece of the distinction is appreciating today's older donor versus yesterday's older donor versus tomorrow's older donor. And that's probably true, not just of older donors, but younger donors 100%. As well, 100%. In terms of the different medium in which they work. Remember when I was at the company doing these campaigns together with you, getting people to adapt and adopt the tech, savvy people, right? To adopt the idea of an online campaign was not obvious. I remember the first time one of the companies reached out to me when I was an executive at an organization to do $1 million 24-hour campaign. I thought they were out of their minds, like completely out of their minds. Like that is not a thing And the president of the organization is like, that's bananas. We're not doing that. Like, and super conservative guy, very smart, very savvy, very successful, wealthy guy, big philanthropist. But he was like, this is bananas. Now, 5 years later, his organizations were all doing online. So there's an adapt period, which is really important. But that older donor, that, what you call the silent generation, and maybe many in the boomer generation, that's past them on some levels. You're still going to have to go sit down and talk to them, in the space of, I'm obviously for large donations, you're always going to have to sit down and talk to them, but how they give, where they give, what they give to, is important. A corollary to this is what they're giving to, or what types of organizations people give to is also shifting. Maybe there's less of like what you might call like legacy in the sense of giving to the same organization for many, many years. I think that's shifting today as well, where people are more younger donors are more cause oriented as opposed to organization oriented. And so if you're in the same space, but you're just not doing it as well as somebody else in the same industry, let's say, they're just going to switch and support that one because that new organization is, scratching that itch for them better than you are. And they're okay to do that. That legacy, that sense of like loyalty to the organization, I think is less so today as well. So those things, like, those are like in the same way that you said about appreciating the older donor of yesterday is not the older donor of today. The younger donor of today is also not the younger donor of yesterday either. And I think that's an important sort of point as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's very, very well said. And I think you sort of hit on a couple things that are different. I think that the younger donors, we'll call them the millennials and the Gen Zers, I think the reason why crowdfunding specifically has taken off so much, I think, is because of that FOMO effect. I don't know that older donors would feel that same way of getting swept up in it. And I think a lot of that has to do with their allegiance to certain organizations that, like, this is who I've been giving to for 20 years. This is who I'm going to continue giving to. And I think that's another really good observation, that younger donors don't have that. It's not a sense of loyalty, but it's the other way around. It's almost like the organizations don't have loyalty to the donors. So the donors are going to move on to someone who does. And in conjunction with that, the one statistic that I saw, I want to see if I can find the source, which I didn't write down, but I'll see if I can find it in a minute, was that when asked, younger donors are more likely to say that they want organizations to report back and communicate with them on what their donations did than older donors, right? So if we're going to group those categories together, the Gen Xer, the Gen Zers and the Millennials are much more likely to, they say that they're much more likely to want communication from the organization than their older counterparts, which means that organizations have to do a better job of communicating. And that again goes into distribution and how you're going to deliver that message. But for me, the biggest takeaway was that younger people want to hear how you use their donation. They want to be told over and over and over again about the impact that they made when they gave. And that I don't know. I think there was more of an acceptance from older people to know that I'm going to give and it's going to go and do good things. And I have to know that the organization's going to go and do good things with my money. And there was sort of like that trust and that allowance that, all right, we'll get the annual report, get a newsletter, and it'll be fine. But it seems like younger donors really want to know more about the way their money is being used, both on a financial level and I think just on an emotional level, just to pull on the heartstrings a little bit. To see how their gifts were being used. So that was a pretty big difference for me as well, thinking this through.
So give me then, like, as you're the guy writing this stuff. So I can give you a practical in just a second, but like, because I'm curious if you know any organizations that are doing a good job with different generational giving, but take it just in sort of in the global, like older versus younger, in terms of, let's say, 3 or 4 different things that are unique to one group versus the other group in terms of an outreach, marketing, communication strategy for them. Like, bullet point them for me for younger and then for older.
Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind is video. I think that organizations, when communicating with younger donors, should do a lot more video. And the beauty of this is because we're in the TikTok, Instagram generation, these do not have to be polished. In fact, I'm someone who is relatively new to the world of video software editing and all this stuff. And I'm
Mhm.
trying to learn more about it. It was really overwhelming at first, right? Because there's like that huge learning curve of how am I going to do this? And it doesn't look super professional. And the more I put stuff out there, the more I see that there is, again, this allowance, this receptiveness to raw videos. And it's not even like, oh, it's okay that it's not super professional. There's actually something beneficial about it being raw. And just if you're an executive director, I'm just thinking in a school because it's an easy example to pick right now, and you're walking past a classroom or director of development, and you just hop on in and take a quick video of the teacher doing his or her thing and send that to a donor or two. It's not polished, it's not scripted, and just be like, I'm walking through the hallways here and I'm thinking of your gift, and
Yeah.
this is what you enabled. To me, I'm not going quickly through my bulleted list here, start to ramble, I see. But video, I think, is a really big one that probably if you sent that to an older donor, I don't know that they're watching it all the way through. And plus you're sending it over email and not a text or a
Yeah.
WhatsApp or whatever. It's like the whole delivery method is also different. So video was certainly one that stood out to me from a communication standpoint.
By extension from video, social media is the extension of video.
I would think so. I mean, there's just so many people that are, and it's not just social media, but it's the right social media. And I think right now, to me, where I'm seeing this giving generation of millennials and to a certain extent Gen Zers is Instagram. That's where I'm seeing the most. Like I feel like olders still more on Facebook. But yeah, putting up these videos and just communicating with donors and showing them what's happening on a day-to-day basis inside your organization and giving those donors credit for the outcomes is just a really, really savvy move.
Okay, video, social media. I would imagine email sort of straddles a little bit.
I think email does both. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
mentioned one before, peer to
Peer-to-peer is something we're seeing on both fronts, the younger and the older front. I think it's really took off because of younger donors. I think that younger donors were seeing what their friends were giving to. They were being asked by their friends to give. And for me to come to you, Benny, and say, Benny, we're buddies. This cause is important to me. Will you please support this cause? You're not going to ask too many questions because of that. I'm sure that happens on the older side as well, but to me, the online nature of it and the way that you're able to communicate that message so quickly seems a little bit more natural for it to land in the younger donors spot. I think we're seeing it also change. So we'll see this. This is still a relatively new, just over the last couple of years, where it's really taken off, and I think it's evolving very quickly. So I'm anxious to see where crowdfunding, peer-to-peer crowdfunding goes, but it definitely was a younger generation thing as it really took off.
Yeah, my experience with the campaigns when I was doing them, a lot of them was when I'm working with an older group, the sell to them to participate was much harder. Uh, and the block around like why would any of those people like give to my organization was such a large block that it became it was like it was funny like if you told them they were going to do the March of Dimes call center and sit down at a phone and just call random people, they would do it, right? But the second it became this peer-to-peer model for them as older donors, even reaching out to their own children or nieces and nephews, whatever it was. I remember a couple of synagogues that I did, older synagogues, and like it just did not take like the urgency around it. You mentioned before the FOMO piece. They were like, like we're gonna raise the money. Like, what's the big deal? And participating in it in that way, they were more inclined to give me more as a donation or to ignore me completely than to step their toe into the idea of playing a role here. And it became very hard to run those campaigns successfully for older generations.
What I found interesting about that is I was learning about crowdfunding, and as I started working at CauseMatch, was that you didn't see that at the higher levels of giving. At the higher levels of giving, there's this acceptance that okay, like I have this fancy dinner, I got to buy a table for $10,000. I'm gonna invite you to come and pay whatever it is, $100 a head, because I know you're gonna do the same thing to me in 3 months. And so at the major gift level, It's like, yeah, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. That's the way this works in social circles. But when it came down to the quote unquote the crowd and looking at double digit gifts or triple digit gifts, but not a 5-digit gift, suddenly it's like that social capital people were much more reluctant to spend.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. One other thing that I would mention here, which I think is important, is the methodology of how people give now. You sort of mentioned it before, I think, but the Venmos of the world, the Apple Pays, the Google Pays, the speed at which people are able to give is a really important factor for younger donors than it is for the older donor who's still maybe writing a check or doing some sort of a transfer through a fund that they hold somewhere, which is slow and used to be slow and cumbersome. So that's really important. Plenty of people I know, and I'm probably one of them, is if it doesn't work quickly, I'm out. Like I'm on to the next one. And so the speed and the efficiency of the technology around the credit card gift, I think, is a real thing for younger donors as opposed to older donors.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. If it's said a little bit differently, if it's inconvenient for me to give, it's I'm not going to do it. It's because it's just not that important. So if I have to get up off my chair, if I'm not able to do it based on the whatever numbers are saved on my computer or whatever, then I'm just not doing it. But I think it extends beyond a credit card gift. I know back in my day when I was starting, the only
In
people
your day,
I said it with a voice. I
millennial.
wasn't really saying. Back in my day, the only people that had donor advised funds were
Yeah.
older and generally more affluent. Now, like people have donor advised funds, and I've spoken to several people that are within our age range, and that people in their 40s, right, that won't give if they can't give from their donor advised funds because they've already apportioned that money out, right? Like if they have to, okay, they'll give something super nominal, but like so there's all of these vehicles that can be used. So that was one of the places where when I set out for this exercise, I was like, oh, we're going to have to make sure that older donors have all of these different ways to give and younger donors have, Venmo and Google Pay and Apple Pay. But it's not true. Younger donors also need these other vehicles, ways to give. I think donor advised funds is just one of them, especially depending on where you are as an organization and the exact demographic that you're catering to as donors. Like people have stocks. People want to have to know that they can give from those stocks. And so, and the other point is that there's so much money that's not liquid for people that and they're able to give. They're still able to give if the organization is set up for it. If the organization tells donors that they're able to accept these different ways of accepting non-cash gifts, like the more that I learn about the sector, the more that I see organizations have to be set up to accept all different sorts of non-cash assets.
I hear it. I would say then, just flip it over for a second. For the older donor who has maybe more time on their hands, direct mail still works. They're going to read. You're going to send them long form content material, reports, whatever it is. They're going to read those things. So I think that's true for older.
It is true, but there's a but attached to it. I am still everything I'm reading says that direct mail still works. The caveat I'm seeing added more and more to these studies is that once again, you have to get people ways to give because fewer and fewer people, even older people, are taking out their checkbook. The last study that I read about this was that checks are going to be obsolete by the end of the decade, which seems like crazy, but like they will be no more by 2030. I've seen other reports that it's going to be even earlier than that. Like checks are like really going the way of the dodo. So even if you're sending direct mail, because it does cut through all the noise, and especially for people like your parents and my parents as well, like direct mail is a great way to get in front of them. There still has to be a way for them to give online or some other way besides writing a check, because again, that's just becoming less and less as time goes on.
Last thing I'll mention, which I think actually goes both ways a little bit, but it came up with a couple of people that was like texting with yesterday about this, was events. And I would say, contradictory answers to the question around events and experiences, in the sense that, half the people I was talking to were very much saying the younger people need the event, want the experience. And half the people were like, you still need to do that event, the dinner or whatever for older people. And then The flip would be like older people, those who thought it was only younger people skewed younger would say older people don't want you wasting your money on these events or on these trinkets or these gifts that you're giving out to people because they're always conscious of every dollar that you're spending as an organizational leader, whereas younger people don't care. They want that. They need that. So it was interesting, just those two things, events, experiences, fun, and then the items too, relatedly, in terms of how that split the different people I was talking to yesterday about the subject of younger versus older.
It's interesting because that's not something that I would necessarily split down age demographic lines. Meaning, I think you're going to have the types of people in the world that don't want any part of my donation to go to anything but the cause. And you're going to have people that need to literally and figuratively be wined and dined a little bit. Like, show me what's happening. Put on a little bit of a dog and pony show to say it more crassly than I actually mean it. But I wouldn't necessarily expect that to be around age, that would be the dividing line. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, it was. And one, and it sort of jogged my memory about one organization where I worked, where the organization was a school. It was a gap year program, and the time horizon from a person experiencing the gap year to the time when they could actually make a donation was years. And if you didn't engage them invest in them during those, what you might call famine years, let's say, where they're not giving, you weren't going to get them when the feast came along years later. And so you had this lag of like almost 5 to 7 years when I did the math on them, where you had to give them the experience, you had to give them that emotional hit at no benefit to you as an organization, with the hope, and I'll say any other term, like even if you're planning it, that when the time comes, you're still going to be available and around to actually make a donation years later, which to one person said to me yesterday, which is why he doesn't spend any time on those people. Because for him, he felt like, why am I spending that time? I'll just wait for them when they're 25, 27 and not do it when they're 19. It's just not, for him, was not worth an investment. He then said the second thing, which I thought was even more interesting, which was he looked back at himself and he realized that most of the organizations he supported when he was younger, he's not supporting anymore. People change, they evolve. And so, maybe you hit a point where at 35, you shift in terms of what you're supporting. And so the likelihood that somebody today is going to be with you for 20 years is very small as a donor. So he was doing the math and he's saying, why am I spending the time on them at 22 when they're giving me $100 when I can start investing my time in them at 29 when they're going to give me $1,000 and they're still going to become that 5-figure, 6-figure giver over the course of those years. And he didn't have to waste, quote unquote, waste all that time in between, it was such an interesting way to think about the different audiences in his book, as opposed to one like mine, which was I had these people, I needed them, and how else was I going to sort of fill the funnel of donors over time without those people in it?
Yeah, how did you respond to this person like that? I mean, not that you can always sit and argue with him if you disagree while you're asking him what he does, but did he convince you that was the right strategy?
For his organizations, it is the right strategy, I think, because it's a little bit more niche. I think when you start to sort of strategize it out and appreciate who he is and where he is in the organizations that he's working in or working with, he has a little bit of the luxury to not invest in that younger audience. He's not a school, so he can do that. But the organizations that I worked with, that either as a coach or for myself when I was doing it directly, that were schools or school related, parents or alumni kind of things, that's the cost. The cost is that that's where you're investing in that, because it's the only way you get to hold on to somebody in the long term. I'll give you a great example of it. At one place where I worked, every year they had an annual dinner. Annual dinner cost, I don't know, $360 to attend, let's say the lowest level. And what ends up happening at that level is you're not getting any of the young people to show up at $360. You're not coming. So there was a guy on the board who every year paid for a table for young people to be at the dinner every year. They didn't have to pay. They could pay what they wanted. But he paid for the table, and every year that group came, right? It was like he had a son who had attended, and he was paying for his son's friends, basically, good group of guys, to attend the dinner every year with the idea that he was basically funding the organization's ability to hold on to those alumni for 5 to 7 years until the time when they can actually give. And it worked. It worked really, really well. And it became a really good strategy where I would say to other people, look, make the donation, whatever you want. Let me give you an example of a way to do it. And I had a couple of people who said, you know, I'm going to sponsor. I'm not coming. I'm sponsoring a table, put as many people at that table as possible. And the idea here is you're going to replace me, right? Over time, you're going to replace me because at some point I'm not going to be interested in supporting the organization. And that's your job is I've paid the 5,000 for the table or the 10,000 for the table. That's the investment. Now you can go do the work on the group of people in that, at that table. So I think there's a lot of like smarts involved in that strategy because it allows you to invest in the long term in a younger donor where I think a lot of the time a board member or a board would look at it and say like, we need more, we need more, we need more, and like stop wasting time, quote unquote, on younger people.
Interesting. Something about that doesn't totally sit right with me.
Which part?
That we're going to ignore that age demographic until they become financially relevant for us. It might be the right move from a business perspective. It doesn't feel like it is to me, but I would want to think about that a little bit more deeply. I mean, like there's so many more other solutions that I can think of, which like the first one that comes to mind is just if you have like giving circles, different levels of major donors, whatever, lower them for people under the age of 45 or under the age of 50 or whatever cutoff you want to be. So if you're considered a major donor at whatever it is, $1,800. Okay, yeah. So for younger donors, you're considered a major donor if you give even $360, right? Even if it's like substantially less than that top tier, that to me is okay. Like to give these younger folks status to habituate them in the process of giving at all and giving to your organization. I think I would imagine that for coming back to your buddy, that it's got to be hard to re-engage someone after they're out of the organization and there hasn't been a whole lot of contact after 5 or 6 years, as opposed to if you're engaging them as alumni and even as potential donors over the course of that time. To me, it feels like that should be the case.
Right. So I think I differentiate between different types of organizations. So if you're an alumni-based organization, school or similar, then you don't have the luxury of giving people up like that. And you have to come up with connecting.
You don't consider your gap year program to be an alumni-based organization?
Yeah, no, in that case I did. So I had a different approach a little bit where I'll explain in a second. But if you're not that, you're more niche or you're, an interest or cause-based kind of a thing, you might establish a strategy to fill the donor funnel with younger people for the sake of the long term. Or you might say, you know what, I don't need that group now. I'm going to focus on 10 more people at 35 and go that way. All right, that works too. So you have to figure out what the angle was. So what I did 2 things. I did 3 things. One, I kept that strategy of paying for tables for younger people. I thought that was really valuable at least at the gala event. 2, I introduced what I called the coffee group, was to donate a coffee a month. Basically, it was like $5 a month right away. So the idea was to get them at $60 for the year in year 1 post gap year, which was almost nothing. It was and it was a monthly thing. So the idea was to get them on a monthly at a very low number, just to get them in the system, just to have them be part of the donor thing, just to have their credit card on file kind of a thing. And then potentially go back to them after year 2 and say to them, hey, let's go to, 2 cups a month kind of thing and increase it in that way. That was a really good approach. There's an institution that my daughter attended as a student that the day she finished the institution, they sent her welcome to the Alumni Association a letter. And I asked her for a donation the next day, which I thought was very aggressive, but very successful.
Was it? That's great.
Yeah, because they had a very low expectation. The idea was just to get her in. And I don't even think it was her money. I think it was probably my money, but
I'm sure it was. Yeah.
Doesn't matter. The idea was to get her paying in that way. The other thing I did was I allowed people to pay for their gala attendance over the course of a year. And so what I would do is I would say, if you paid if you donated $1,000 over the year to the organization, then you were a silver donor and you got $1,800 level,
Right.
you know, listing at the dinner, even though you were $1,000. And with the idea of that, okay, it's $1,000. $1,000 is not nothing. That's a good amount of money for a young guy to give to the organization, a young man, a young woman, whatever. And then, year two is to say to them, hey, you did 1,000 last year and it was great. How about going to the 1,800 this year? And if they said no, I'd go back to them for the 1,000, which is fine, and then try it again the following year. So that strategy, that worked. I thought that was good. I think there's a lot of ways within those spaces to approach that. I wouldn't do that with somebody older. In the only cases where I did something similar with someone older was somebody who had been a really good donor, was having a tough time, who I wanted them to still attend. I'd still give them the respect and honor that they had earned over the course of years, even if they couldn't give me the same amount of money, and counted them at that level, capital earned, capital spent kind of a thing. And with the idea that this is a long game. So in year 2, year 3, years later, they'll come back and they'll appreciate how we handled it, and they'll come back to that level later on. I think that doing that was trying to keep getting people in the funnel early, getting them paying, getting them part of the culture of giving, which is not obvious and not natural necessarily in those spaces, and then hoping over time that you're going to build them up over time.
I love those strategies. And as you were talking, it sort of clicked as to why I don't like the strategy of I'm going to say it extremely ignoring this demographic, because I think, as the example with your daughter, the first gift is the hardest. It doesn't matter what the amount is. Getting the first gift is the hardest. Getting a second gift is significantly easier. Still hard, but easier than getting your first gift. Statistic that's jumping out in my head right now, and I think I can find these. We can maybe put them in the show notes if people are curious as to where they come from. But I saw that it was something like 75% of millennials and Gen Zers consider themselves philanthropists. And when that same question was asked to an older demographic, to the Gen Xers and to the baby boomers, it was like 35-40%. Right. So the point is not how much people are giving. The point is the identity of the person. People consider themselves philanthropists. It's possible that sort of the definition has changed a little bit. That word used to be sort of reserved for people that were giving major gifts, and now sort of anyone who gives a significant amount, whatever that may be, to charities would consider themselves a philanthropist. But the point is that younger people, even when they don't have as much disposable income as their older counterparts, they're still considering themselves, they're still identifying as philanthropists, which is why getting them into that habit of not just donating, but donating to your organization is important. The organization has to go and earn their gift over and over and over again. There's no question about it. And there's no given that just because I'm giving to you at 22, I'm still going to be giving to you at 42. I would like to think that when you're getting someone, a 22-year-old, to give to your organization, you're setting that stage for at least the potential for a lifelong gift.
Okay, so almost out of time. I hear that. So let's break it down to really quick, takeaways, strategies, right? So from what I hear from you today, it's going to be a multi-channel, diverse approach. Assuming you're a multi-generation organization, let's say, right? It's okay, fine. So you have both sets of donors in your organization. Number one, your strategy is going to be multi-tiered and diverse in terms of multi-channeled approaches to outreach, right? That's one. Tell me when I get it wrong. Two, because that's true, the medium by which you use in those different channels is also going to be different, right? So you're going to do email versus a long form or short form based on wherever you're going to be, video versus text, in another media, whatever it's going to be, right? So you're going to be strategizing in the approach to those audiences with those content. So if you're thinking TikTok or Instagram or whatever, right, you're thinking younger audience, therefore the method or the message, this is part 3 of it, the message has to resonate with that audience on that medium, right? Nothing I've said so far is actually specifically related to nonprofits and fundraising. It's really just how you might market to really anybody. Here's where I think it shifts a little bit. The method of giving. So we have to have multiple ways for people to give as well. So you need to be able to have people still give checks. You need to be able to have people give through a donor advised fund now. You need to be able to have mobile wallets and Google Pay and Venmo and whatever, PayPal or these other versions and these online portals. And the last thing, which I think is right inside your area, is the stories have to be resonant on the different channels, on the different methods for the different audiences. And I do.
I think you nailed it. Nailed it. No notes.
Okay, so I would then add the last thing here for those of you who listen to this point. Take the following test. Find one strategy where you're working right now and test it with your own fundraising. So take a story that you're using for a younger audience and see how you might massage that message or tell that story differently to an older audience, and then find the right medium for that older audience today, or the reverse. If you're an older audience organization, figure out how you might tell that story on Instagram, on, TikTok, or on a YouTube short, or whatever it is, and see how that actually works for you. It's going to be super uncomfortable when you do it, for sure. But I would challenge the leaders right now to figure out, because otherwise, to finish here, they're leaving lots of opportunity on the table by not trying to engage with the same content, just veered slightly differently to a different audience in a different place.
It's great. Love it.
Awesome. Okay. We will leave it here.
Alrighty.